Before I begin, let me just say thank you for being here. My name's David, and what I'm about to share isn't easy. It's the story of how trust once broken can nearly cost you everything. I tell it not for pity, but so no one else has to learn the hard way like I did. If stories of betrayal and survival matter to you, if you believe in justice and truth, and in hearing the voices of those who lived it, then please subscribe to this channel. Every listener gives strength to the telling, and I'd be grateful to have you with me. I turned 68 this past October, though I don't celebrate much anymore. Birthdays stopped being milestones after my wife Carol passed. These days, they feel more like markers, reminders that I've made it another lap, when truth be told, I'm not sure why I'm still running. But that morning, when I stepped onto the porch of my small house in rural Ohio, there was a box sitting neatly by the door. No return address, no card, nothing except my name, written in a hand I knew too well. The kind of handwriting that stirs your gut before your mind even catches up. It was Daniel's, my son. 3 years had passed since I last saw him. 3 years of silence, not because of some blowout fight or final straw, but because distance can grow the same way weeds do, quiet, steady, until one day the garden you once tended is nothing but thorns. We drifted, and then we stopped calling, and eventually the silence felt easier than the sound of trying. But I would know his handwriting anywhere. The sharp strokes on the W, the way the B curled low like it was bowing out of the line. My chest tightened. Not joy, not relief, something heavier. Something like grief that had been waiting for me in the dark. I carried the box inside. It wasn't heavy, but it carried a weight I couldn't name. I set it on the kitchen table where the morning light came through the blinds in slats of golden shadow. For a long while I just looked at it. Then I pulled back the tape. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a bottle of bourbon. Not just any bottle, the kind you see locked behind glass at a liquor store, the kind people post photos of to show off rather than drink. A limited edition, dark glass, with an emerald green label and gold lettering so fine it looked pressed by hand. A wax seal covered the cork. It gleamed in the morning light like something sacred. I reached out and traced the edge of the wax with my thumb. It was smooth, too smooth for something meant to be broken. A thing to admire, not to consume. I felt a pang deep in my chest, not from my heart condition, but from memory. Bourbon used to be my ritual. After a long day fixing engines or mending fences, I'd pour myself a glass sit on the porch and let the world slow down. Carol would join me with her iced tea, and we'd watch the fireflies take over the yard. She never cared for whiskey, but she liked the way I did. Slow, steady, one glass at a time. Never too much, always just enough to soften the day's edges. That ended 3 years ago, when my heart failed me. The doctors gave me a new regimen pills, at sunrise pills. At dusk, no more fried food and no more bourbon. If I wanted to see 70, I had to cut out the things that gave me joy. Daniel was in the hospital room when the doctor said it. He didn't look up from his phone then. His thumbs kept moving across the screen. I told myself he was trying to distract himself. But maybe he was already gone even then. I hadn't had a drop since. Not a sip. Not a cheat on holidays. I kept the bottles I had back then, lined them up like soldiers on the shelf in the garage, but never touched them. They were memories, not temptations. So why would Daniel send me this? He knew I couldn't drink. He knew it better than anyone. The bottle wasn't just a gift. It was a reminder of what I'd lost, or maybe what he wanted me to lose. There was a card taped to the side of the package, a plain white envelope. Inside, just 2 words written in that familiar blue ink, "Happy Birthday." No dad, no signature, no warmth. Just the words standing there like they were ashamed to say more. I stared at them until the edges of the card blurred. I felt old in that moment. Not in the way the body aches or the joints stiffen, but in the way silence can weigh more than words. I didn't open the bottle. Didn't even consider it. I slid it to the far end of the table, turned back to my coffee, and tried to steady my breathing. The house felt emptier than it had a moment before. The clock over the stove ticked in its deliberate way, each sound a reminder of the time that had already gone missing. My thoughts drifted to Thomas Granger Carroll's brother-in-law, though I'd long since stopped thinking of him in terms of relation. Thomas was family in ways blood often failed to be. The man who showed up with his truck when storms knocked down half my roof. The man who never arrived empty-handed, who dropped by with tools or a bag of seed, who always had a story about the good kind of trouble he'd gotten into in his younger years. If anyone deserved something nice, it was Thomas. And what was I going to do with this bottle? Leave it on a shelf to gather dust, to glare at me as a reminder of what I couldn't have that felt like an insult. By late afternoon, the bottle was buckled into the passenger seat of my Chevy. I don't know why I did that habit maybe, or some instinct that said it deserved more respect than to rattle around on the floorboard. The sun had turned amber by then, laying long shadows across the fields. I drove the familiar county road past soybean stubble and the faint smoke of burn piles. Thomas's house sat on a rise just outside town, white clapboard with a wraparound porch that belonged on a postcard. He opened the door before I could knock still in his work boots, sawdust clinging to his flannel shirt. His eyes went straight to the bottle. "Walter," he said, his voice puzzled, "what's this?" "A birthday gift," I answered simply. "From Daniel. Figured you'd get more use out of it than I would." He turned the bottle in his hands, admiration in his eyes. "This is something Walt, something rare." "Then make tonight special," I said. "Don't wait." He grinned at me in that easy way he always had. "I think I will." I left him with it and drove home, the late light slanting across the dashboard. But as the gravel crunched under my tires and the road stretched out before me, I couldn't shake the thought Daniel never spent money like this. Not on me, not on anyone. When he was younger, he borrowed more often than he gave. So why now? Why this? The question sat in my chest, heavier than the bourbon ever could. The house was quiet when I returned that evening. Too quiet, the kind that doesn't feel restful but hollow. I set my keys on the counter and stood there listening for sounds that weren't there. No footsteps, no laughter, no Carol humming in the kitchen while she chopped onions. Just the tick of the wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. I thought maybe I'd done the right thing handing the bottle to Thomas instead of letting it sit and haunt me. He was the kind of man who could turn anything into a story. He'd pour that bourbon into a couple of glasses, maybe invite some neighbors over, and by the end of the night, it would be a memory to hang on to instead of just a bottle collecting dust. That felt better than keeping it under my roof where it didn't belong. But the peace I expected didn't come. Instead, unease sat in my stomach like a stone. I made myself a pot roast for dinner the way Carol used to do, filling the house with the smell of onions, carrots, and slow-cooked beef. It's the kind of meal that demands to be shared, but I sat alone at the table with the roast steaming in front of me and no one across the plate. The food tasted fine, but it didn't settle right. Each bite felt heavier than the last, like I was chewing through the silence itself. I pushed the plate away before I was halfway done and carried the rest into the kitchen, wrapping it up for leftovers I knew I wouldn't want. When the phone rang, I nearly jumped. Almost nobody calls my landline anymore, not since Carol passed. I picked up my hand, damp on the receiver. "Dad." It was Daniel. His voice casual, almost lazy, like no time had passed. My heart stumbled in my chest. I hadn't heard that voice in 3 years. "Happy birthday," he added, but it came too late, too rehearsed, like he'd practiced it and still couldn't quite pull it off. "You got my gift?" he asked. I swallowed. I did. "Well," he said, pausing, "what did you think?" "It's a nice bottle," I answered carefully. "Did you try it yet?" His tone sharpened just slightly, as if the question mattered more than it should. "No," I said. "I passed it along to Thomas. Figured he'd get more out of it." The silence that followed wasn't static or a dropped call. It was deliberate. A long, heavy pause that pressed into me through the phone line. "You gave it to Thomas." His voice was flat, cooled down to something I didn't recognize. "That's right." There was the faint sound of an exhale, slow and measured. Then the line went dead. I stood there, holding the receiver to my ear long after the click. My gut twisted not from the roast, but from something deeper, something less tangible. The way he'd asked about the bourbon, like it wasn't just a gift, but a test. I replaced the receiver and looked around the kitchen, every corner of it familiar, every shadow, ordinary, yet nothing felt steady. I turned out the light and went to bed, but sleep didn't come. The hours dragged restless and shallow. When I did drift off, dreams pulled me back to the hospital room. 3 years ago, Daniel's face lit by the glow of his phone, while the doctor listed all the things I could no longer have. I woke before dawn. The sheets twisted my body stiff. I made coffee and sat with the paper, but I couldn't focus on the words. My eyes kept drifting back to the kitchen counter where the bottle had sat the day before. Now it was gone, and still it haunted me. By mid-morning, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. I hesitated before picking up. "Mr. Briggs." The voice was tight, a woman's voice. "Yes. This is Susan Thomas's wife. I thought you should know. Thomas is in the hospital. He collapsed this morning." My hand tightened on the receiver. The room seemed to shrink. "They think it might be some kind of poisoning," she said quickly. "He was fine last night, but this morning he could barely stand. They're running tests." The coffee in my mug went cold in an instant. Poisoning. "Did he eat anything unusual?" she asked. I couldn't find my voice at first. My eyes had already landed on the counter at the empty space where the bottle had been. "No," I managed. "Nothing unusual. But I gave him a bottle yesterday." "What kind of bottle?" "Bourbon. A gift from my son." Silence stretched across the line, filled only by the faint beeping of hospital machines in the background. "I'll tell the doctor," she said finally. "If you think of anything else, anything at all, please call me." I promised I would then hung up. I sat in the stillness of the kitchen, the October light, pale and thin, my mind replaying every step of yesterday, as if rewinding might undo it. I rose slowly and went to the trash bin, telling myself I was just looking for distraction. That's when I saw it, a small plastic vial buried near the bottom. The kind vitamins come in, but without a label. A faint dusting of white clung to the inside. My pulse stumbled. I didn't remember throwing it away. I picked it up carefully, the plastic cold against my skin, and set it on the counter. My eyes drifted to the refrigerator. There on the middle shelf sat a mason jar half filled with bourbon. I'd poured a little off for Thomas as a sample before giving him the bottle. I hadn't even remembered keeping it until now. My hands shook as I set the jar beside the vial. And then a name came to me. Mark Collins. We'd served together more than 30 years ago. He'd been the medic in our unit, and these days he ran a small veterinary lab on the edge of town, the kind of place that could test substances without asking too many questions. He still owed me a favor from my winter years, back when I pulled his truck out of a ditch during a snowstorm. I called him. "Mark, I need you to test something for me," I said quietly. "What is it?" "Bourbon, and maybe something else." He didn't ask more questions, just told me to meet him after closing. That evening, I wrapped the mason jar in a paper bag, tucked the vial beside it, and placed them carefully on the passenger seat of my Chevy. The sun was low, the air sharp with the smell of smoke from somewhere in the county. I started the engine, the weight in my chest heavier than steel. Mark's lab sat where the town thinned cornfields, a low cinder block building with a single lit window and a metal door scuffed white by boots and winters. The parking lot was empty except for his dented Tacoma. I pulled in beside it and let the engine idle a moment longer than I needed to, the way you pause on the threshold of a room when you're not sure what you'll find inside. He opened the door before I could knock. The smell of disinfectant met me first, clean, chemical, decisive. Behind it, the faint iron of animal blood and the dry hay scent of kennel crates. He wore a lab coat over a gray sweatshirt sleeves, shoved up wrists, freckled by sun and old scars. His eyes flicked to the paper bag I carried then to my face. I didn't give him much to read. He didn't ask for more. We moved through a narrow hallway into a room washed in fluorescent glare, stainless tables, a centrifuge with a red sticker, racks of labeled tubes neat as soldiers. He set the bag down like a fragile thing and unrolled it, methodical, no wasted motion. The mason jar looked smaller under that light, the bourbon darker, like the room had wrung all warmth from it. The little plastic vial sat beside it, innocent as a button. Mark worked in silence, hands in powder blue gloves. He poured a measure from the jar into a sterile tube, capped it, labeled it with the date and time in his square block letters. He did the same with a rinse from the vial, using a saline swirl to coax out whatever clung to its walls. He noted temperature's chain of custody, a list of steps that made this real, in a way my stomach already knew. He glanced up once, not for permission, just to make sure I was still standing. I was, barely. "I'll run preliminary screens tonight," he said, voice steady, not unkind. "The deeper panel takes longer. You'll get a call either way." He didn't promise answers. Men like us learn not to. I nodded. I left him with the samples. Habit, or maybe superstition, made me keep a finger width of bourbon in the jar. A proof of origin, a last witness. Mark saw it and didn't object. A friend who understands that sometimes the thing you hold back is the only way you believe the rest happened. Outside, the air had cooled to a clean edge. The sky over the fields wore a thin band of orange, like the day couldn't decide whether to quit. I drove home, slow, letting the empty county road unspool beneath the tires. The world looked normal, the gas station sign blinking its price, a porch light across the way, clicking on for no one, but the normal felt like a lie. Someone was trying to sell me cheap. At the house, I set the mason jar back in the refrigerator behind the milk, where cold could keep it honest. I washed my hands twice, though I hadn't touched anything that would come off with water. I stood in the kitchen, not moving, listening to the small sounds a house makes when it thinks it's alone. Wood, settling the refrigerator, motor, kicking in the clock over the stove, clearing its throat every second. I tried to eat. A slice of bread, a spoon of the pot roast cold from the plastic tub. It turned to paste in my mouth. I drank water and tasted metal. On the kitchen table, I laid out a yellow legal pad and drew a line down the middle. On the left, I wrote what I know. On the right, what I can prove. The pen felt heavy. The page looked too clean to hold what I needed it to. I started with the left. Daniel sent the bottle. Daniel called and asked if I'd tried it. He went quiet when I said I gave it to Thomas. Thomas collapsed the next morning. I found an unlabeled vial in my trash I didn't put there. I saved a sample. Mark has it. On the right side, the words were thinner. The bottle exists. The sample exists. The timestamps on the phone calls. The hospital's record that Thomas was admitted. Proof felt like a ladder missing rungs. I left the pad open on the table as if the facts could multiply while I slept. Sleep was a word I used out of habit. I lay on the couch with a blanket that still smelled faintly of Carol's lavender detergent and counted the lines in the ceiling until the counting ran into dawn. A few times in the night, I thought I heard a car roll by slow. I didn't get up to look. I didn't want to know their headlights had found my windows. Morning came like a decision. I made coffee I didn't want and stood at the sink while the kettle hissed. My hands felt too big for ordinary tasks. The phone sat on the counter, a small animal ready to startle. When it rang, I answered before the second sound. Mark didn't clear his throat. He didn't apologize. He'd been a medic. He knew the cost of softening bad news. Prelim says, plant toxin, he said. White snake root, Ageratina altissima. Cows eat it. It gets into the milk. People die. That's the old story. In extract form, it's more efficient, easier to dose. I ran the control twice. It's not a false positive. For a second, the world narrowed to the little crescent crack in the countertop near the sink, a mark I'd meant to fix for 5 years and never did. I put my palm flat on the cool laminate because if I didn't touch something, I wasn't sure I'd stay upright. Level looks deliberate, Mark added, enough to put a heart on its knees. Yours, certainly. Thomas's too, if he's on beta blockers. He was. I didn't say it. I didn't say much at all. The truth had arrived without luggage. It planned to stay. I'll push the full panel, he said. You'll have formal numbers for anyone who needs them. Thank you, I managed. I meant it more than those words could carry. After the call, the house felt different. Not safer, not louder, just honest. The bourbon in my fridge was no longer a question mark. It was a blade with a label. The card with happy birthday in my son's handwriting was no longer a sad attempt. It was part of a plan. The weight in my chest was not grief alone. It was the shape of intention. I called Susan to ask after Thomas. She said he was in the ICU, the monitors scolding him into staying. They were waiting on toxicology. He'd asked what day it was and nodded like he didn't believe her answer. She didn't ask about the bottle. She didn't need to. Some griefs have the decency not to say their own names. I put on a clean shirt. I shaved with a slow hand. When I looked in the mirror, a man looked back who had been many men, husband, father, mechanic, soldier, patient, and now he was something else too, a witness. I didn't want the title. I didn't get to choose. I drove to the hospital with a magazine I knew Thomas wouldn't read. St. Joseph's smelled like all hospitals' lemon cleaner over fear. Fluorescent bulbs that made every face a shade paler than it had any right to be. His room hummed with machines doing their quiet arithmetic. He lay there washed out, mouth parted for a tube that wasn't there anymore. Breath going in and out like it had been given instructions and meant to follow them. I stood at the foot of the bed with the magazine under my arm and told him in words no one else needed to hear that I was sorry, that I should have seen the trap and the gift, that I would not let the story end with him being the lesson and nothing else. His eyelids twitched. Maybe it was a reflex. Maybe it was the muscle memory of a man who refuses to let go of a rope. In the cafeteria, coffee tasted like it had been made in a building that didn't believe in flavor. I held the paper cup in both hands anyway, like it could warm something farther in than skin. On a napkin, I wrote the word "why" and underlined it until the fibers bled. Sometimes a question is a map. Sometimes it's a hole. Back home, I took the legal pad from the table and added a new column to the right side. What I will do. 3 lines. Call the police when I have the formal report. Do not contact Daniel until I've handed over everything. Lock the doors as if intention comes with keys. The last line felt theatrical as I wrote it. I wished later I'd taped it to the door. Near evening, the sky bruised in that Midwestern way that promises no rain and delivers mood anyway. I checked the back door, then the front, then again. Habit and something uglier. I set the mason jar deeper behind the milk. I put the card with the 2 blue words in a fireproof box with the house deed and Carol's ring, evidence and marriage side by side. When the phone rang, after dark, it wasn't Mark. It wasn't Susan. It wasn't a number I recognized. I let it go to voicemail because I'd learned something in 24 hours. I should have learned years ago you don't have to answer just because something calls your name. The message icon blinked. I didn't press play. Not yet. I sat at the table with my hands on either side of the legal pad and let the clock tick me toward whatever came next, one small measured second at a time. I didn't press play on the voicemail until morning. Pale light spread over the kitchen table where my yellow pad waited with its 2 columns. I set the phone beside it and listened. Daniel's voice slipped in like a draft under a door. He kept it casual, the warm-up before a sales pitch. We should talk sooner rather than later. Don't make things worse. He didn't say what worse meant. He didn't have to. When the message ended, the room felt short of air. I wrote his words with the time and number the way I learned to record small wars. Then I put the phone face down and waited for my hands to stop shaking. They did slow as frost melting off fence wire. At St. Joseph's, Thomas looked a shade less gray. Machines kept count at his bedside with a patience people don't have. Susan sat with a travel mug cupped in both hands. I told her what I knew piece by piece. Careful as a man building a ladder he has to climb. Plant toxin, white snake root, preliminary but not a mistake. The mason jar in my refrigerator, the full panel on its way. She nodded. A doctor came in wearing that hospital face duty mixed with distance. The good news, Thomas's rhythm was behaving better. The bad, their tox screen suggested a plant compound they couldn't yet name. I thanked him for telling the truth and watched his shoulders drop. Back home, the sky was a washed Ohio blue. I checked the mailbox because ordinary acts keep a man from drifting. A circular, a bill, a postcard from a dealership that still believed I wanted a newer truck. Inside the house met me with hush. Hush isn't silence. It's a held breath. I moved the milk and saw the mason jar where I'd left it. Relief cut sharp. I set it back and lifted the kitchen trash lid to toss the circular. The bag sat wrong, turned inside out the knot, retied by a hand, careless with symmetry. I stared, then lifted it. Coffee grounds, onion skins, a length of twine. Nothing else. I'd taken the vial to Mark, but the wrongness lodged anyway. Someone had looked for something. I walked the rooms without turning on lights. Back door locked. Front locked. Windows latched. The front deadbolt strike had a fresh hairline scratch, the kind made by a key that doesn't belong. In the junk drawer, I found a spool of black thread. I taped a line low across the inside of the front door just above the floor, and another at the back. An old corporal taught me that trick you don't trap an intruder. You trap your doubt. I made a sandwich I didn't taste and ate it at the sink watching the oak in the yard. The swing there had been quiet since Carol. Today, it held still, like a hand refusing to wave. Mark texted that the lab had logged the samples. Numbers to follow. I stared at the word numbers until it stopped looking foreign. Numbers don't heal, but they guide. I wanted to call the police. The impulse rose like fever-hot insistent, but I pictured walking in with maybes and a preliminary and the slow nod of a detective who had seen too many stories start with certainty and end in dust. I decided to wait for the full report and for my hands to finish the letter. Afternoon thinned into evening. I swept the kitchen because a man should be useful to his own house. The bristles made a soft shh. I set out the pill sorter. I changed a smoke detector battery that had been chirping for a week. Near dusk, a car paused at the corner. The engine idled a beat longer than a stranger's would. I stood to the side of the window and slid the curtain with 2 fingers. A gray sedan with tinted glass sat there, lights off. A shape shifted. The engine rolled forward, then gone. I couldn't see the plate. I wrote down the time. After dark, the phone rang once and quit. Another message slipped in without a ring. Do not disturb was still on. I let them sit. When I pressed play, the first was a warranty recording. The second was Daniel softer than yesterday, like he was speaking from a room with thin walls. We were making a mess of something that didn't need to be messy, he said. This could have been handled family to family. He didn't say police, but the shadow of it crossed the floor. I wrote his words again and tucked the note into the fireproof box with Carol's ring beside the white card with 2 blue words. It felt wrong and right to keep love and evidence together. Before bed, I walked the house, a slow circuit. The threads at both doors lay undisturbed. I turned off the lights, left the hall lamp on, and chose the couch over the bed, because from there I could see the front door and the wash of headlights. I set my boots by the armrest laces loose. Sleep negotiated. In it, I stood in my old garage shelves of bottles lined like a skyline, each wax seal an unopened door. Water rose around my ankles, and somewhere a landline rang with patient insistence. When I woke, the room was quiet and my heart worked like a professional. I lay there and thanked it aloud. Morning would bring numbers or it wouldn't. Either way, the house now knew my name, and I knew its, the doors, the threads, the hush, the jar behind the milk, the box with the ring, the man who refused to drink a gift, and the son who turned a gift into something else. I made coffee and watched steam lift like prayer in a place that didn't believe in easy miracles. The day waited quiet and watchful. The call came just after 8 when the coffee still steamed and the kitchen hadn't decided what kind of day it would be. Mark didn't pad anything. The full panel matched the prelim white snake root compounds, concentrated and intentional. He read numbers because proof wears numbers, micrograms per milliliter controls that behaved blanks that stayed blank. Enough to stagger a healthy heart, enough to stop a damaged one. When the line went dead, the story inside my house changed shape. A bottle wasn't a bottle anymore. It was a tool. A gift wasn't a gesture. It was a plan. I stood with both hands on the sink rim and looked at my reflection in the window, a man who had run out of excuses. I called the floor nurse. Stable, she said. Still monitored, still tired. I thanked her and kept the rest in my throat. Susan answered on the second ring. He keeps asking for the time she said and then apologizes. That sounded like Thomas, a man who felt sorry for the rain. I set the phone down and began the only work that made sense. I opened the yellow legal pad and added a third column beside what I know and what I can prove. I titled it, What I Will Do. Then I drew boxes and filled them photograph. The bottle print, the lab, email, transcribe the voicemails back. Everything up to the old thumb drive in the tin with Carol's spare keys. Replace the recorder batteries, tell no one where I'm going. The pocket recorder still wore the scuffs of other years. I fed it fresh batteries, pressed the red circle, and watched the light declare itself alive. I said my name and the date. I shaved, put on the jacket with deep inside pockets, the one Carol said made me look like I kept promises, and slipped the recorder to the left, Mark's numbers to the right. I locked the back door, checked the front, and stepped over the thread I'd taped low on the frame. It lay undisturbed, a whispered boundary. Daniel's subdivision sat where Fields had surrendered, deciding every house matched the next. Even the mailboxes wore the same plastic smiles. Nothing felt particular. His truck was waxed and squared in the driveway. He opened the door after one knock. The air smelled like lemon cleaner and staging. Inside, the rooms were neat in ways that don't happen by living coasters, and a grid books arranged by color, a tray of bottles asking to be admired. I told him Thomas was in the hospital. I told him the lab had named the poison. I watched his eyes instead of his mouth. He asked about doctor's insurance pills. Not the questions of fear, but of audit. I let silence go to work. The refrigerator coughed. A wall clock dandled from 1 minute to the next. I mentioned the wax, the label, the cereal near the punt. I did not mention the mason jar behind my milk. He did. He said something that shouldn't be said by accident about me, always keeping a little taste tucked behind the milk in one of those old jars like the ones Carol used for peaches. He aimed a smile toward a memory. It hit concrete. I held his gaze and let quiet finish the job. I didn't ask how he knew what he shouldn't. I didn't reach for my pocket. I let the recorder do the remembering. I left before he could repair the sentence. In my truck, I pressed stop then play. His voice came through small and clean. Behind the milk. I drove to the grocery store lot and parked at the far edge. I wrote the time and place on a receipt, tucked it with a pad when I got home, and slid the recorder into the fireproof box with the card that said Happy Birthday the Lab printout and Carol's ring. Afternoon leaned toward evening. I put soup on and forgot it long enough to make the kitchen smell insistent. I stirred and thought about how I'd mistaken silence for medicine. Time fixes wood only if you hold the break together. Left alone, it warps. I read Mark's report twice. Trematol derivatives, a footnote about milk sickness. Concentrations that don't happen by luck. Numbers shaped like intent. I squared the pages against the table and felt steadier than I had since the box landed on my porch. I called no one and answered nothing. I checked the threads at both doors. I moved the mason jar deeper into the fridge and wrapped tape around the lid that said, Do not discard. I packed a paper bag with Copy's lab report, phone log, timestamps the receipt with my handwriting, and set it beside my boots so my morning feet would see it before my mind could make excuses. Night settled. The porch swing stayed still. A car coasted past without stopping. Somewhere, a dog barked once and thought better of it. I rinsed the pot, left it upside down to dry, and turned off every light but the one in the hall. I lay on the couch and felt the absence of the recorder's weight against my ribs, replaced by the slow, patient work of my heart. I pictured Daniel as a boy with peach on his palms, eyes bright with the simple magic of showing a father what he'd found. I let that memory stand in the doorway. It didn't come in. Before sleep, I added one more box under what I will do. Tomorrow take the bag to the station and ask for a detective. If the doorbell rings late, do not answer. If a voice uses your name, do not open. If a memory knocks, let it pass. Outside, the air cooled to a clean edge. Inside, the clock kept the only promise it knows one small second after another toward the day I'd finally decided to meet head on. Morning carried its own kind of weight. I woke with the sun pressing through the blinds, a pale stripe across the couch that told me the night had done its part, kept me alive, if not rested. The bag with the papers leaned against my boots, waiting like a quiet witness. I brewed coffee, but it tasted like metal. I drank it anyway. Small rituals keep a man's mind from scattering. I ate half a slice of toast, left the rest, and stared at the door where the black thread still held firm. No one had crossed while I slept. That counted for something. The drive to the police station was only 15 minutes, but every light seemed to test my will. I caught myself, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were pale. I thought about turning back more than once, about letting the bottle be a mystery and the voicemail a misunderstanding, about how quiet life could be if I just refused to look too hard. But then I thought of Thomas, in that hospital bed chest, lifting with a borrowed rhythm, eyes apologizing for things he never did wrong. And I thought of Carol the way she once told me that truth doesn't rot. It waits, patient as mildew, until you notice the smell. At the station, the air smelled of dust and ink. A receptionist in uniform looked up polite but distant. I asked for a detective. She asked if I had an appointment. I shook my head and held up the bag. It's important, I said more to myself than to her. 10 minutes later, Detective Harris appeared. Middle-aged tie, loosened eyes, the kind that had seen too many stories twist themselves into knots. He led me back to a small room with 2 chairs and no clock. I unpacked the bag onto the table, papers first, then the recorder. I laid each item out like cards in a hand. Harris didn't touch them at first. He listened. I told him about the bottle, the handwriting on the card, the hospital, the lab reports. About the scratch on the deadbolt, the retied trash bag, the gray sedan that idled too long at the corner. I told him about the voicemail and the sentence Daniel let slip behind the milk that tied the whole story to the jar in my refrigerator. I didn't dress it up. I didn't accuse. I let the facts stand in their own boots. Harris finally reached for the recorder, pressed play, and listened to Daniel's voice spill into the room. He stopped it, rewound, played it again. Then he clicked the pen in his hand 3 times quick. A tell, maybe. Do you still have the bottle? He asked. Yes. And the mason jar? Yes. Both untouched? Yes. He scribbled on a pad, then looked at me for the first time in full, like a man measuring the edge of a blade. We'll need those, he said. Something inside me both settled and flinched. Settled because someone finally believed. Flinched because belief meant no turning back. I signed forms, surrendered copies, and gave him my number again in case the world suddenly decided to eat it. When I asked what came next, he didn't offer comfort. Just procedure, evidence, intake chain of custody toxicology, confirmation interviews. He warned me to keep my distance. Let us handle it, he said. I nodded, but inside I knew distance wasn't a thing I could measure anymore. Daniel wasn't across town. He was under my roof in my kitchen behind my milk. The drive home stretched. Every car in the rear view felt too steady. Every pedestrian looked too interested. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my shirt clung damp at the collar. The house greeted me with its hush again. I checked the threads, both unbroken. The mason jar still sat cold behind the milk tape, tight across the lid. I opened the fireproof box, slid the signed police paperwork beside Carol's ring, and closed it with a snap that sounded final. Afternoon blurred into small tasks, sorting mail, tightening a loose hinge, wiping the counter twice, though it was already clean. The brain needs work when the heart is waiting. Susan called from the hospital. Thomas had eaten half a sandwich. He asked if I still had his fishing rod. She said he smiled when she reminded him it was propped in the garage. That image, him smiling, even fragile, gave me more strength than any number on a lab sheet. Evening settled. I stood on the porch with the swing still as ever. Across the street, porch lights winked on one by one. Ordinary life moving forward. My life paused between breaths. At 9:14, my phone buzzed. A new voicemail. No ring again. Daniel's voice, lower now, almost strained. You didn't need to go this far. It could have been handled clean. Think about what you're doing. I saved it, wrote the time, and placed the phone face down. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The house already knew, the station already knew, and so did I. That night, I slept on the couch again. Boots closed, the bag gone, but its absence heavy. I dreamt of a courtroom, faceless people shifting in pews, and a gavel that never struck. Only the waiting. When I woke, morning was already at the window. The threads still held. My heart still worked, and the story had crossed the point where even silence couldn't turn it back. Harris called just after 10. The lab would receive the bottle and jar today. They'd request nearby camera footage. He ended the same way, keep your distance. I agreed, though. Distance felt like a trick word with my son somewhere inside my locks. I cleaned to keep the mind from wandering. Counters wiped, towels folded, floor swept. Small tasks that end when so little else does. Near noon, the threads I'd set at both doors were still unbroken. I ate oatmeal that sat like paste. A quick knock came light and patient. No one on the porch, only a flat manila envelope on the mat. At the table, I opened it with a butter knife. Inside, a single phone print, my porch at night lamp, on swing still. The angle put the photographer across the street near the maple. No person, just my house watched. I photographed the photo, sealed both in a sleeve, and called Harris. Don't discard anything he said. An officer would log it, and again, distance. Officer Patel arrived in 15 minutes. Careful, methodical, he photographed the envelope. The print, the doorway, the street. I told him about the gray sedan from yesterday and the time. He wrote it down and left with the evidence. The house settled into a new hush. I made tea, watched steam climb. The swing creaked once. No wind. Wood talking to itself. At 2, my phone lit with a name I hadn't seen in months. Maya, my daughter-in-law. We hadn't spoken since the last holiday that didn't happen. Her voice sounded used up. She asked if I was safe, then let out what she'd been carrying, jars in their garage. labeled with masking tape letters she didn't recognize, WSR on more than one. On her old laptop, she'd seen search histories she wished she had an extraction dosage trematol. And one more truth, if I wondered whether Daniel still had a key, I could stop wondering. After the call, I pulled down the little tobacco tin from the hall closet. Inside, 2 brass keys labeled in Carol's hand, front and back, and a third with no label, the cut a hair off ours, the metal too new. I set it on the table and looked until looking felt like touching fire. Harris came for it himself. Patel photographed the key, the tin, the shelf, the fresh scratch on the deadbolt's strike. Harris bagged the stranger with gloves. Prints on brass are a wish he said, but they'd try. He didn't gloat about the scratch. He just saw it and kept going. He said they were drafting a warrant, the lab numbers my recording the photo Maya's statement, and the key made a line a judge could follow. He left me with the rule he kept repeating: if anyone knocks after dark, call 911 before you speak. Evening leaned in early. I scrambled eggs I didn't eat and wrote the day on my yellow pad envelope with photo. Patel, call from Maya, unknown key. My handwriting looked pinched and efficient, as if economy might steady me. At 6:11, the back door alarm shrieked. The door was shut. The thread I'd set low lay snapped on the tile. Through the glass, no one, just the yard-holding dusk. Wedged under the handle, a folded sheet of printer paper. I took it by a clean corner and laid it flat. 6 words in heavy marker stop, inviting them, or I finish this. I photographed it on the door and on the table, sealed it, and called Harris. An officer was nearby. Distance, he said again. I sat with my hands flat and waited. Patel returned with another officer. He logged the note, tested the alarm, lifted the broken thread with tweezers, and taped it to a page like a vein. He asked if I could stay with a friend. I told him my house and I had work to finish together. He let that stand. Night took the rest of the light. I left the hall lamp on and chose a chair where I could see both doors without turning my head. The phone went to Do Not Disturb. A car idled for a count of 20 and moved on. Somewhere a dog reconsidered a bark. The refrigerator kept its steady hum like a metronome for ordinary life. A text arrived without sound. Daniel, we don't have to do this. You're making a spectacle. It won't end how you think. I copied every word onto an index card and slid it into the fireproof box with the others. The latch on that box is the only sound in this house that feels like an answer. Before midnight, I checked the front thread. Still intact. I let my finger rest on the line and felt a current I couldn't name fear, braided with resolve. I lay on the couch without undressing and watched the door until its outline lived behind my eyelids. I let a few pictures pass and didn't invite them to stay Thomas on a dock with a fish a little smaller than his story. Carol dusted in flour, smiling at nothing in particular, a boy under a cap too big asking for one more pitch. Dawn pressed a gray hand through the blinds. I sat up, bones declaring themselves. The back thread was gone to evidence. The front still drew its line. The key was bagged, the photo logged, the note tagged. The distance I'd been told to keep had finally been drawn, for me ink across the bottom of a door. I stood, stretched the stiffness out of my shoulders, and waited for the only call I wanted. The warrant is ready. Outside, frost held to the grass along the curb. Inside, the tea kettle ticked as it cooled. I breathed with it slow and counted and kept my phone within reach. I set a chair by the window, listened to the quiet tick, and reminded myself to keep breathing slow and steady. The call came at 7:46 a.m. Warrant signed. Team rolling. My orders were smaller than my fear stay home. Answer, no door, keep the phone charged. I checked lines like a man bracing for weather. The front thread lay taut. The back alarm blinked red. I dated a fresh page on the yellow pad and underlined it twice. Waiting filled the house. With the sounds of waiting, the clock's throat clear's breath, held too long, the kettle cooling on the stove. At 8:19, a text, evidence team on site. Stand by. Relief felt like a bolt surrendering a quarter turn. I put on my jacket anyway, not to disobey, but to breathe. I parked 2 blocks from Daniel's cul-de-sac. Distance kept. Witness allowed. The street could have been printed driveways, in parallel shrubs trimmed to a template. County cars slid in without lights. 1 marked unit, 2 dark sedans, a van with bright cases inside. Approach, announce, pause, entry, no theater, just gravity. The door let them in. I couldn't see how only the rhythm threshold crossed rooms absorbed. The van's side door opened. Clear bins appeared sealed, labels blank. Patel stood in the doorway with a clipboard. Lemon cleaner reached even the car. At 9:12, my phone buzzed. Found plant material in garage, multiple jars. Standby. The garage door lifted. Light fell across a scarred workbench. On it, mason jars. In a row, masking tape labels WSR. A gloved tech, swabbed capped, clicked. A photographer took the same picture from 3 distances. Notebooks followed spirals with chewed edges, margins marked by triangles. Columns of dates beside initials. WBTG, half-dose symbols. Whole numbers pressed hard enough to dent the page below. Someone carried out an unsealed envelope by the corner. A single sheet inside. My name printed at the top. At the bottom, 5 words. You'll understand why when it's over. Between them, a tree sketched with its roots circled. The page slid into a sleeve and was labeled. Maya arrived with a banker's box tight against her ribs. An officer met her at the sidewalk. She handed over an old laptop, a cracked phone, a stack of printed emails. She didn't look back at the house. Curiosity collected, curtains nudged. The team ignored it. Another text, not home. Locate request issued. Some part of me had been waiting for cuffs and a door. But of course, he wasn't there. People who draw triangles listen for wind. I left before the last case slid into the van. Distance isn't only feet. On my way home, I passed the empty farmer's market lot, white lines bright on gray. I saw Daniel at 10, chasing a paper boat, a grin that pulled weather forward. That boy would have jarred fireflies. The man wrote doses. Back at my door, the front thread still lay intact. I stepped over it and sat at the table. I wrote what I had seen, timed the team arrived bins, carried out WSR on jars, notebooks with symbols and initials, the envelope with the line and the drawing, Maya's box absence of Daniel. Writing tightened a hinge that had started to pull from its screws. Harris called, just after noon, voice steady from a day already long. Positive field tests on the jars, lab to confirm, notebooks logged, letter bagged, preserve orders filed for phones and accounts. I would not be needed at the station today and should stay off the edges where tempers live. I told him I'd kept a record. He said it would help. Belief doesn't lighten a man. It gives his hands somewhere to put the weight. I ate cereal because a body needs something, washed the bowl, and left it to drip. The house felt larger and emptier at once. Near 3, a text from an unknown number. You never did know when to quit. I copied it to the pad, then onto an index card for the fireproof box. It slid in among Ring's receipts, timestamps the recorder, and a white card with 2 blue words. I walked the perimeter. Fingertips found door frames and window latches. The swing stayed still. The maple kept its little bells. A freight train spoke from far off. I made tea. Guilt is heavy. Shame has shape. The guilt was for the gift I handed Thomas. The shape was for the boy I raised into a man who kept initials in a notebook and wrote my name on a page with the middle left blank. Roots mean cause. They do not mean excuse. Evening arrived early. I put the phone where my hand could find it without my eyes. I moved the mason jar farther behind the milk and checked the tape warning me not to throw away what could save me. I read the date at the top of the pad and the 2 underlines pressed too hard. The house answered with a hush that wasn't empty, just waiting. Sometimes the air thins before weather changes. The room felt like that, a pressure you can't point to. I considered calling Susan and didn't. Considered the cul-de-sac and didn't. Considered sleep and knew it would come in minutes and leave in seconds. When full dark settled, I checked the front thread again. Still taut. Still telling the truth I needed. I turned off every light but the hall lamp and chose the chair that saw both doors without turning my head. My chest found a slow, workable rhythm. I let the day be what it had become, a turn in a story that could no longer pretend to be a misunderstanding. Somewhere, officers flattened pages, logged jars, and put numbers to the thing that had nearly ended Thomas and was meant to end me. Tires rolled past without stopping. I kept the least heroic promise a man can keep. I breathed. I stayed. I waited for the next knock to prove itself before I moved. and the house patient as winter kept its watch. 2 mornings after the search, the phone vibrated on the table, and I knew before I looked. Harris said they had him. A trooper pulled a silver sedan on State Route 23 for drifting over the line. The plate matched the locate. In the passenger footwell, an overnight bag and a notebook, too new for the rough life my son had been living these last days. He didn't fight. He asked for a lawyer. The news arrived without triumph. I sat at the kitchen table with the yellow pad and wrote the time in the margin. The front thread still lay taut. The mason jar still hid behind the milk with tape across the lid. The house didn't exhale. It changed rooms inside me. Arraignment came the next day. I took a back pew where the air conditioning hummed too loud for October. Daniel wore county orange under a borrowed blazer, wrists cuffed. He stared past me like the room was something to be endured, not survived. The judge read the charges: attempted murder, possession of a toxic substance, tampering. Bail was argued in words about flight risk and danger. The decision was simple and hard: no release. Maya sat 2 rows ahead, hair tied back like someone preparing for a storm, not a photograph. She didn't turn. When it was over, she handed a small plastic tub to the state thumb drives, a phone with a cracked corner, a labeled envelope of printouts. Then she left by a side door. I remained where I was until the room emptied and the hum sounded like it belonged to me. Days telescoped into hearings. The defense filed to suppress the notebooks, the jars, the letter, the key with the new bite. The judge listened, looked over glasses that rode low, and denied most of it. Chain of custody had been tidy. The search had walked in through a door the law had unlocked with the warrant Harris had built. A date was set. I wrote it on the pad and underlined it once, not twice. Underlining does not change outcomes. The assistant district attorney, a woman named Keller, with a voice like unvarnished wood, sat me down in a small office that smelled of old paper and black coffee. She didn't ask me to be what I wasn't. She asked if I could tell the story without trying to decorate it. I told her I could. She said courtrooms don't heal, they sort. My job would be to carry my piece to the proper pile. Trial opened on a Tuesday that felt like late November, though the leaves still clung halfway to their branches. The courtroom wood was dark and honest. The jury looked like a cross-section of the county, a farmer with hands like spades, a librarian whose eyes measured everything, a nurse whose posture said she'd seen worse. The judge explained the ritual. The ADA stood then the defense. Words like duty and doubt put on their uniforms. Evidence arrived in a long line. Harris took the stand first, with a map of the day the warrant knocked. He spoke of how doors open when paper is in order of jars labeled with masking tape and 3 letters that matched the lab's vocabulary of a notebook, with initials and triangles and whole numbers pressed hard enough to scar the next page. He was careful with his verbs. He never said "knew when found" would carry the weight. A chemist followed hair in a low knot glasses that caught the lights. She said the word trematol without drama. She explained derivatives and extraction and why the numbers were not an accident. She used controls and charts and the math of certainty. The jury did not nod. They watched. Numbers do not ask for affirmation. The hospitalist testified about Thomas admission arrhythmia enzymes the way plant toxins announce themselves, if you know the grammar. He did not speak of fear, only heartbeats and what steadied them again. Susan sat in the gallery with her hands folded like prayer without theater. Thomas came later, walking slow-voiced, thinner than his life. He told the room about a taste he'd called unusual and the floor arriving too fast the next morning. He did not look at me when he said he remembered my face at his bedside. He didn't need to. Maya's turn came. She carried in a box again, but lighter this time. She spoke about jars in the garage labels she didn't recognize. The way light falls different on glass you're afraid to touch. She described browser histories, screenshots of instructions for extraction that read like recipes for something you'd never want to serve. She told them about the key, how he'd never given it back, how she hadn't thought the keeping mattered. She did not cry in the room. I knew the shape of the space where she would later. Digital evidence arrived in printouts, and timelines locations pinged off. Towers searches performed at 1:12 a.m., a text thread with a prepaid number that read like logistics, not affection. Not a sentence quoted the way a movie would. Just phrases in black, first poor timing with meds don't overdo old heart. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Then my name was called, and the floor turned to something soft. I walked to the stand and raised my hand for words I meant to keep. The microphone made me louder than I felt. Keller asked me for dates and objects. I gave her the porch, the box, the card, with 2 blue words, the bourbon seal and cereal. The phone call with the question that didn't belong had I tried it yet. The long silence after I said I'd passed it along. The vial in my trash. The mason jar behind the milk. The lab numbers Mark spoke and then the state confirmed. The threads on my doors. The manila envelope with my house in night on glossy paper. The folded sheet wedged under my back door handle that told me to stop inviting help. The recording with a sentence that shouldn't exist if the world were about to be kind behind the milk. I did not tell them how I had failed or where my shame sleeps. Courtrooms sort, they do not cradle. I kept my answers the width of their questions. The defense stood and tried to hand me a different version of my life. They suggested I had reasons to be cruel, that I'd sold a parcel, without his blessing, that men of my age struggle with dates and lines and penmanship. They brought an expert who believed handwriting was a weather vane and said the card might not be Daniel's. They suggested the mason jar was contamination, that my house had introduced what their client had not. Keller didn't object to the barbs that weren't questions. She objected when the law asked her to. When she rose again, she asked for nothing new, only that I remind the jury of the bottle still sealed. When the state took it, the residue on the open bottle in his house that matched what sat in my refrigerator, the notebook with my initials, and the number beside them that the chemist said meant an ending. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. By the time we rested, afternoon sun had moved across the wood and made a square of warmth on the bailiff's shoes. The judge sent us home with instructions not to read, not to talk, not to think out loud. I walked down the stone steps with my hands in my pockets and the weight of a man who had told the truth in a room that could use it and might not reward it. That night, I did not turn on the television. I sat with the house and listened to its ordinary sermon, the tick of a clock that doesn't care how days end the motor, of a refrigerator keeping vigil over a jar that had nearly become a memorial, the low wind that talked to the maple without asking for consent. I wrote one sentence on the pad: courtrooms don't heal, and under it a smaller one, verdicts only sort the pieces. On the porch, the swing held, still like it knew enough not to move. I thought of Daniel at 5, under summer lightning, counting the time between flash and thunder against my arm. I thought of the man in a blazer, over county orange eyes, aiming at a future I'd spent a lifetime trying to keep him from. I thought of Thomas's hand on my forearm, strong even when his heart wasn't. The night put a hand on my shoulder that was not comfort. It was something else, recognition maybe. Morning would come, and 12 people would begin their work. I set the phone face down, checked the front thread one more time, and told my heart to keep doing its quiet professional job. It did. The rest was out of my house and out of my hands. The jury filed in after 27 hours. I sat in the back row, my yellow pad on my knee pen, capped because no one can take notes when their hands sweat. The judge cleared his throat and told the gallery to remain silent, though silence had already poured itself into the room like concrete. The foreman stood paper in hand, voice steady with the weight of strangers deciding what a family cannot. Guilty on attempted murder. Guilty on possession of a toxic substance with intent to harm. Not guilty on tampering. They said the jar in my refrigerator left doubt about where contamination started. 2 words, heavy enough to break a lifetime. Guilty, guilty. My chest released a sound I hadn't planned. Not relief, not grief. Something between a cough and prayer. The gavel struck. Daniel was led out. He didn't look back. That was the part that hurt most. Outside, the air bit colder than the calendar promised. Reporters with recorders angled like weapons waited, but Keller brushed them away with her hand, flat and firm. Not today, she said, and I followed her lead. My car carried me home without music, only the rhythm of tires and the knowledge that my son's footsteps would now echo against concrete for years, measured in decades. Sentencing would come later. For now, the verdict lived like a stone in my pocket. Back at the house, the front thread sagged. I unwound. It rolled it into my palm and set it in the drawer. Its work was finished. The back alarm blinked once and stopped when I pulled the battery. The tape on the milk jar was curled and brittle. I peeled it away, rinsed the glass, and left it upside down to dry. Evidence had become memory. Memory was still too loud. That night, Susan and Thomas came by. She brought cornbread wrapped in foil. He carried the faint shadow of fatigue under his eyes, but moved with strength the hospital had not predicted months earlier. We ate quietly at the kitchen table. When Thomas reached for the butter, his sleeve brushed the yellow pad. He glanced at it, dates, times, notes scrawled like a ledger, and said, "You kept us alive." I shook my head. I almost didn't. His hand pressed my wrist in answer. No argument, just presence. Sometimes the mercy isn't in words. Later, after dishes, Susan stood in the doorway and said softly, "You'll have to let yourself rest." Rest was a language I had forgotten, but I nodded. The night didn't need me awake to guard it anymore. Weeks turned into a rhythm therapy sessions, where strangers with kind eyes told me guilt is a coat, not a skin. Check-ins with Keller where sentencing numbers grew from statutes to years. Calls from Maya, who apologized for all the things she couldn't have stopped and all the things she didn't know. I told her she owed no apology. She said she would never stop feeling like she did. Shame travels different routes, but it reaches the same stations. The sentencing came on a Wednesday morning, sharp with frost. Daniel wore the same blazer over county orange. The judge spoke numbers, 25 years on the first charge, 10 concurrent on the second. Eligibility after 15. I sat with my hands folded, not from prayer, but because they shook when empty. He didn't turn toward me when they led him away. I suppose I shouldn't have expected him to. Fathers don't always earn the final glance. Back home, I opened the fireproof box one last time. Inside the card with 2 blue words, the folded note with my house in, night, the index cards, with copy text the recorder. I added the final entry, a single sheet on which I'd written verdict delivered. Pieces sorted, healing remains unscheduled. I closed the lid, locked it, and placed it on the top shelf of the closet. Not because I wanted it gone, but because some burdens need altitude. Evenings grew quieter. The maple dropped its bells, one by one. The porch swing creaked only when I allowed myself to sit in it. I found myself staring at the horizon longer than necessary, not searching for headlights, not bracing for knocks, just looking. The world had returned to ordinary size. Ordinary was its own kind of miracle. I began to walk again down streets where neighbors nodded without asking questions. Some had read the headlines, most had not. They only saw an older man measuring steps, filling lungs, holding posture against a wind. In those walks, I discovered the sound of birds returning the slap of leaves underfoot, the way the sun finds the last edge of a fence at dusk. Survival, it turns out, is quieter than the fight. One afternoon, I drove to the hospital not for Thomas, who was now back at school, but to hand the staff a box of cookies, baked poorly in my own oven. I thanked them for carrying what I couldn't. A nurse smiled with eyes that remembered but did not linger. That was enough. Life doesn't give back what was burned, but it does leave soil. In that soil, I planted rosemary by the kitchen window. Its scent filled the air when brushed, reminding me that not all jars hold poison. Some hold flavor, some memory, some hope. I do not forgive Daniel, not yet, maybe not ever. Forgiveness is not a duty, it is a door, and some doors stay shut. But I do remember him at 5, chasing lightning, and at 10, laughing at a paper boat. I let those versions of him exist beside the man who wrote my initials in a notebook. People are not one thing. They are rooms. Some rooms you lock, some you leave lit. I've learned to walk the hall without opening every door. So the story closes here, not with triumph, not with ruin, but with something steadier, survival, scarred but standing. I tell it not because I want pity, but because silence is an accomplice. Stories spoken aloud make the shadows smaller. If you're listening, you've kept me company, and for that I'm grateful. Before I leave, you let me ask if stories like this matter to you. If they remind you that justice, even cracked and imperfect, can still land, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, share these words, and come back next week for another journey through betrayal, resilience, and the slow rebuilding of a life after fire. Because in the end, every story, no matter how jagged, deserves to be told, and every listener makes the telling lighter. The house is quiet now. The swing is still. The front door thread is gone. The jar is washed. The fireproof box sleeps on the shelf. And I, for the first time in too long, allow myself to rest. That's where my story ends for now. The wounds are still there, but so is the strength that carried me through. If sharing this helps even one person feel less alone, then it was worth telling. If you'd like to hear more stories like mine of betrayal survival and the hard lessons life forces on us, please subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these stories alive. Until next time, take care of yourself, hold on to the people who truly stand by you, and goodbye for now.